Discussion this morning. The idea is about promise, reality, and impact, measuring, monitoring, and maintaining nature-based solutions as they relate to climate. I'm Mary McDonald, Senior Vice President of Conservation at WWF Canada. With me today is Simon Reddy, Director, International Environment from the Pew Charitable Trust, and James Snyder, our VP at WWF Canada for Science, Knowledge, and Innovation. We've all seen the important role that nature can play to fight climate change and build resistance to climate change that's already underway. At this COP, we've seen two initiatives emerge under the action agenda: a roadmap for a transition away from fossil fuels and deforestation roadmap. So on the one hand, fossil fuels, on the other hand, nature. As everyone knows, a focus on avoiding emissions from the destruction of carbon sinks and building up carbon ecosystem is not new in the climate context. Hold on, what do I got here? There are a growing number of nationally determined contributions, NDCs, that include nature-based emission reductions. Most, not all, note the role but fall short on actual targets. And there's often a gap between the promise of carbon and nature solutions and the details of their application for meeting emission reductions. Today we want to examine some of these issues and share examples with a particular emphasis on measuring, monitoring, and maintaining nature-based solutions. So the reality part of this, an impact part of this story. I'm gonna start, I'll just sit down and start with a question. Okay, Simon, maybe you'll go first. Can you reflect on the role that nature-based climate solutions play in NDCs? And can we count on them? Are they reliable?
Thank you, Mary. And firstly, thank you for the opportunity to be on this panel. From the outset, I want to say that nature-based solutions are no substitution to emissions reductions, just to be absolutely clear, but we think they have an important role to play. Nature-based solutions in terms of terrestrial, I think, have been around for quite a while. Where we work at Pew Charitable Trust, where we're focused on is marine nature-based solutions, and in particular, coastal wetlands. We work exclusively on the three habitats identified by the UNFCCC and the IPCC, which are basically salt marsh, seagrass, and mangrove. There's a lot of other work going on around things like fish carbon or whale carbon. For us, that is not an area that we are interested in. And it comes down to your point about, is it measurable, is it manageable, and is it monitorable? Is it real, basically? Can you actually follow that habitat? Can you measure, monitor, and manage that habitat over time to ensure that the commitments that you make are actually met and they are maintained? So, as I said, we focus on seagrass, mangrove is our key area, and what we're trying to do there is establish baselines, put those habitats, or work with the countries that we are working in and the local scientists that we're working in to put those habitats into an NDC over time. And I can talk a little bit later on examples, but that for us is an important area. Is it actually having an impact? I would say it's a growing area of interest. There's a lot more interest in the ocean-climate nexus. Why? Because the ocean absorbs heat from climate change, it absorbs carbon. It's becoming increasingly, people are recognizing the important role that it's playing. And I think we all recognize that that role cannot continue unabated, given how we treat the ocean as well. And we need to think about the ocean in terms of resilience and in terms of what can we do to make the ocean more resilient. And I think that's where some of these roles around coastal wetland NDCs, as we call them, have an important role to play. I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks, Simon. James, same question.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. And so my response will focus mostly on like the kind of domestic application of this in the Canadian context, where NDC, in Canada's NDC, for instance, there's explicit recognition of nature-based climate solutions, the role of protected and conserved areas, but the gap between that NDC and the reality of the and challenges of the reporting, I think, is pretty considerable. And some of the main issues that we'll unpack later on in the session today, whether it is in coastal wetlands and estuaries in terms of the vast benefit of those systems, tidal estuaries, coastal wetlands. So much of the conversation domestically in Canada is focused on forests. As you might imagine, with huge swath of the boreal forests in Canada, tremendous importance there in terms of intact forests in the north. But of course, the emerging issue of wildfire is a huge part of that discussion, how those emissions from wildfire factor into our accounting on an annual basis. And certainly, the world was watching in 2023 with some of the most significant wildfires that we've ever seen, and the emissions that are associated with that. So, these are cornerstones of what practical realities of nature-based climate solutions in the Canadian context increasingly face. One other dimension that I also want to bring forward is the recognition of peatland ecosystems. I don't see nearly enough of that discussion in terms of the recognition of peat. In Canada, that is a huge store of ecosystem carbon, just massive, and how we can account for that storage, how we can address the conversion of those peatland ecosystems, and what that might mean in terms of significant tipping points in terms of future emissions from those ecosystems is certainly a top of mind, and then how we account for that in our national accounting, how we include that in our NDCs, both through a protected area strategy and beyond. But the connections, and certainly one that we've heard loud and clear the last 2 weeks here at COP30 between the nature and climate crises, and then in turn the solutions that we can implement, and especially at the community level in terms of delivering benefits for climate and nature, to me bring great enthusiasm in terms of what we can achieve together. And I think we'll speak about a couple of those examples in a minute.
Okay, thanks, James. Simon, certainly you and your team are doing amazing work in Eastern Africa on the marine side of things, at the coastal. So, do you want to share a few examples of this that relative to this sort of space?
Yeah, absolutely. So, this was a new initiative for Pew back in 2019. And our first 3 countries that we started working in were Seychelles, Belize, and Costa Rica. And we've now expanded out to 10 countries in total, adding in Kenya, Mozambique, Madagascar, and Tanzania, but also Panama, Honduras, and Jamaica. I'll start with the first 3. I'll start with one in particular with the Seychelles. And I think it's important to point out how we work as well, and I can come on to that later. But what Pew has recognized, and I think other people are recognizing it, is from day one you have to invest in that country that you're working in. All too many times when you initiate these types of projects, organizations, can be NGOs, can be other governments, they kind of go in, start doing this work. It's done by external consultants. They produce a lovely report. It gets delivered to the country and it gets put on a shelf and forgotten about. And so from the very start, we identify partners in country. So for instance, in the Seychelles, we work with SACAT, which is their Climate Change Adaptation Trust. And what we did from day one was to work with government, SACAT, to look at this whole idea of how could we put coastal wetlands into their NDC. I should say Seychelles is a very progressive ocean nation, and so there was a lot of willingness to do this. Now they had, as you can probably imagine, Seychelles doesn't have a lot of mangrove because it's mainly an island nation, but it does have an awful lot of seagrass. And they had initially had this mapped just using satellites, and they thought they had 2,000 hectares of seagrass. So we started this project mapping using satellites, but then doing ground truthing. And the ground truthing was very much focused locally, with support from government, with support from SECAP, from Seychelles University, local NGOs. And what the ground truthing is that the computer will pick random spots around the EEZ where you go out and you check, did the satellite imagery get it right? Was it seagrass or was it seaweed? And actually, after we did the ground truthing, what we actually found, they've got 160,000 hectares, not 2 million. And of course, that's really important when you then look further down the line at issues such as financing and NDC, which I can come on to. So we did that work with Seychelles. They committed to put 50% of that seagrass into their NDC by 2025 and 100% by 2030. They're actually already at 98%, and they expect to do 100% by next year. That's 162,000 hectares of seagrass protected by the end of next year. As I said, it's very much locally driven, locally led. The capacity was already there. We were able to enhance that capacity. And if I can stick on the sort of Eastern African sort of like continent there, we've expanded the project using Seychelles as a sort of thought leader in the region. And we've now expanded the project to Kenya, Mozambique, Madagascar, and Tanzania. And we have a kind of sub-project where we're mapping the seagrass for the whole of that eastern seaboard. It's being led by WIOMSA, which is the Western Indian Marine Science Association, based out of Zanzibar. And they have set up their own organization. It's called LASMI. You can find it online. It's the Large-Scale Seagrass Mapping and Management Initiative, so LASMMI. Look up LASMMI seagrass, and you can find all about it. So we're mapping the whole of the seagrass in the region, and we're working with local universities, local governments, national governments, so that they are part of this whole process from day one. And that means that they have ownership of the project, they're in control of what happens, which means that they're invested in it, and that's the important thing. They're invested in the research, they're invested in the data gathering, they're invested in the policy decision making, and then they're invested in their NDC. And of course, the next step after that is looking at financing. I'll stop there because I could go on for ages.
I think you said it. What percentage of the Seychelles NDCs are MBSs?
Sorry.
What percentage in the Seychelles that has an NDC? What percentage is MBS?
Well, they committed to a third under their debt swap.
It's a third.
A third.
It's a debt swap.
And a lot of that does cover seagrass areas, but some of that is also outside. Some of the seagrass is outside of that area as well.
Oh, okay.
So they will be creating additional reserves outside of that.
Okay, that's pretty significant percentage. Yeah, of an NDC. Okay. James has got a little bit of. You have some slides actually to answer
Yeah,
this.
no, I'm really delighted to be able to share a couple slides to kind of.
I just want to say, to be fair, Simon joined us a little bit later and forgot to mention slides.
Completely unfair, man.
No one told me I could bring slides. I could have shown you some wonderful slides.
I needed a leg up in some ways.
So it might look on
I feel you've got an unfair advantage.
Exactly, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, go ahead.
But no, I'm really
James.
delighted to have a chance to present on some of the work that's underway in Canada, and so much of this is in deep partnership with Indigenous nations who are really driving forward the measurement of ecosystem carbon in forest, wetlands, grasslands, coastal estuaries, and just the recognition, of course, this tremendous amount of ecosystem carbon in Canada is really on the traditional territory of Indigenous nations from coast to coast to coast, and that we know systematically that Indigenous managed lands are more biodiverse and more rich in ecosystem carbon. And that has driven so much of our work at WF Canada over the last 5 years, and a cornerstone of our strategic plan, which is Regenerate Canada, which at its core is in support of Indigenous-led nature-based climate solutions and delivering those benefits for climate and nature and local communities. And in some ways, over a 5-year term now, we've really been able to see the inception and growth of a community of practice with the focus on Indigenous nations, local communities in terms of the measurement of ecosystem carbon in the fields, and bringing forth both those technological tools. We heard, of course, that that gap, Simon, as you alluded to, between remote sensing and then in-field measurement, and then how that ladders up into the broader national reporting that we do. And this is the reality of what effective nature-based climate solutions will look like, is using these tools, these mechanisms, the cutting-edge technologies wherever possible, but so much of it at its core is in the field and has to be community-based in terms of really driving effective measurement and reliable information. And so over this 5-year term, we've invested in a strategic approach to advancing indigenous-led and community-based measurement of ecosystem carbon. And I'm going to step through here just a couple examples of that in the Canadian context. Going back actually to Glasgow COP26, we were privileged to announce on a similar stage the creation of a carbon map for Canada. And so this was a remotely sensed product developed by McMaster University that allowed for the first time that spatial representation of where that ecosystem carbon is. We know, I have that intuitive sense, of course, there's a massive amount of carbon in nature in Canada, but to map that in terms of above ground carbon and to see where that is distributed across the country and to put a quantitative measure to that was really a foundational piece for us in terms of the use of remote sensing and machine learning tools by the McMaster University team. And in the map that you can see in front of us, you can see some of these areas that really pop out of just tremendous ecological importance, but also the carbon stored there. The overall number here, so 327 billion tons of carbon. So petagrams here, but 327 billion tons of carbon stored in nature, above and below ground in Canada. Is just a jaw-dropping amount. And so much of that is in places like the peatlands in the Hudson James Bay lowlands, one of those large areas that you see here in central Canada, extending from eastern Manitoba through western Quebec, is the Hudson James Bay lowlands is one of the largest contiguous peatlands in the world. And within that region, 30 billion tons of carbon stored there alone, and an area that is under significant threat from expansion of new infrastructure, including the role of potential critical minerals on the southern border there. And so this is I would say, one of the very clear realities of what the decarbonization / nature-based climate solutions nexus of what that means in a Canadian context is playing out in the Hudson James Bay. But this is one of a couple examples I'll be presenting today. So one other piece I kind of alluded to but want to build on is the role of technology. And so in a country as large as Canada, we knew from the onset that we would need to be catalyzing the innovation of new tools, new approaches, the measurement of ecosystem carbon. And so over a 2-year period, we were able to bring forward a technology challenge with Microsoft and others as a partner to bring forward innovation, catalytic innovation in terms of the measurement of ecosystem carbon at the community level. And we saw, I think, a real explosion to some degree of interest in this field. Is an emerging area. Like if you go back into 2020, this is absolutely an emerging area. This is not a mature space, but is one that is rapidly evolving. And the tools that are out there, whether it's from drones, from UAVs, and then of course we've talked about satellite monitoring a couple times here. It's such an important part of the conversation. I won't dwell too much here, but just some of the examples of the types of measurement of ecosystem carbon that are underway in Canada, both at the community level and by research partners in the academia and beyond, whether it's looking at carbon storage in terms of the existing carbon pool, or the use of things like flux towers in terms of the measurement in a year-over-year basis of the actual sequestration of those ecosystems, so that we can bring that into hopefully our national reporting. One of the elements in terms of where WF Canada has really seen the opportunity and importance is at the community level in providing resources and materials and training for community partners. And so just above Simon's head there, you'll see a QR code, which is actually a link to a page that has a series of protocols and methodologies in terms of the measurement of ecosystem carbon at a community level, in terms of how you can make a peat core, how you can measure ecosystem carbon in a forest, above ground biomass, and also the creation of tools and resources around the importance of ecosystem carbon that have been translated into some indigenous languages, like here in terms of Inuktitut, also in terms of Cree some of these materials that have been identified and used, and support community-based work. So please, I encourage you to use those tools as best as possible and check out that site there that's linked. But I do want to bring forward some examples in field of what this work really looks like. And so one of those examples that I'll be diving into here momentarily is in those Hudson James Bay lowlands, work led by Mushkegowuk Cree and the Mushkegowuk Council in Northern Ontario, where members of a number of the Mushkegowuk communities were involved over a sampling season in terms of taking peat cores to understand peat depth. And I can't stress the magic of peats and just like this literal accumulation of carbon over thousands of years into this dense stand that is, if not my height, maybe taller in some areas. And just that kind of understanding of the history of what it's taken for that ecosystem carbon to accumulate, and in turn how perilous the destruction of those peatlands could be in terms of the emissions from it. And that was so apparent in the work that you see here, led by the Mushkegowuk Cree and the Mushkegowuk Council, and certainly the importance of that area, both domestically in Canada as a nationally important area, but I would say globally as well as an area of globally significant ecosystem carbon storage. In addition to that, in Atlantic Canada, alongside the Mi'wapukek First Nation, who have been developing a Guardians programs now for several years, and this actually is an intersection between both coastal and terrestrial ecosystems, where there have been work in terms of advancing the monitoring, for instance, of eelgrass meadows, for culturally significant purposes, but also understanding and mapping those areas so that they can be understood, reported on, and protected. The Mi'wapukek First Nation has efforts underway in terms of number of indigenous protected and conserved areas, ranging from both terrestrial and marine ecosystems, and are also looking in terms of expanding their work in terms of indigenous forest management, which is one of the, I think, emerging conversations generally in Canada in terms of the re-indigenization of forest licenses, now which are underway, managed by Crown governments across the country, and the efforts of indigenous nations, First Nations, especially in terms of resuming the rights and responsibility of management of their forests on their traditional lands, and doing so in a way with a view to ecosystem health, and of course carbon and the benefit for species and culturally important species is a big part of that conversation as well. One last example that I want to bring forward to you is work in the BC interior. So we spoke about fire and how, of course, that is one of the significant challenges in terms of nature-based climate solutions, especially in the Canadian context, and the role of fire. WF Canada has been privileged to work in support of the Sepwemikuluku Restoration and Stewardship Society for over 6 years now. The SRSS was formed in about 2019 in response to a wildfire, the Elephant Hill wildfire, which was a 192,000 hectare fire. It's a massive area, 192,000 hectares. That was only one fire. In subsequent years, there continue to be fires in this region. And while those fires haven't necessarily been at quite that scale, the cumulative footprint of that fire on the landscape, and I've had a chance to stand in this area and actually see firsthand these forests that have burned at considerable scale. And then in turn, the efforts that are underway now by SRSS to see broad-scale restoration, complex ecosystem restoration with benefit for both the carbon that's stored in these ecosystems, but also for biodiversity and culturally important species and cultural medicines as well. That to me is a really, I feel again privileged to be part of that project and the work that they do. Just some quick numbers there in terms of the work that SRSS and the Sepwemik communities have underway. Over the last 5 years in part, they've now planted more than 2 million trees across this area, up to about 1,200 hectares now. But the vision there very much is about building long-term resilience to this landscape. And with more time, I think I would probably speak to you about the historical drivers of what's led to the risk of these ecosystems in terms of both the cultural suppression or the suppression of fire management, indigenous fire stewardship practices, and also the cumulative footprint of industrial forest harvesting and forest management activities that have brought forward an emphasis, of course, on timber extraction, and how the SRSS and the Secwepemc communities are working to bring forward a view of ecosystem health and of forest health that will have benefits for ecosystem carbon as well. One last piece before I hand things back to Mary is just to, again, bring things back around in terms of the role of technology. And this is a piece of work that's just underway this past year with a number of the partners, the Secwepemc community, Skeetcheston First Nation, the Innovatree Carbon Group, and the Second Pass Forestry, which is the use of distributed sensors. And so in this case, soil moisture sensors that allow the community to evaluate the relative conditions for the regrowth, in this case of culturally important plants, to help them determine and enhance the survivability of their efforts in terms of complex ecosystem restoration. This work to me is really exciting in that the soil moisture sensors that are, of course, the real-time sensors available on a distributed network are also just the beginning of what we can do in terms of the measurement, and that can include, fire detection, fire risk detection, biodiversity monitoring in terms of, for instance, things like acoustics, and the role of this kind of expansive monitoring network that is in support of Indigenous communities and their priorities, to me, is something that I think has considerable momentum, and I hope will continue to grow, building from this project in the years ahead. And just the last thing I would just say is the growth of this program over the last 5 years. I've given 3 examples now, just in terms of the work in Hudson James Bay, Atlantic Canada with Pukek First Nation, and with the Secwepemc nations in the BC interior. But this work is growing across the country, not restricted, of course, to peatlands and forests, but also into coastal wetlands, estuaries, and beyond. And our WF Canada team really does want to see this as an area of continued growth, because we see it as a cornerstone of what effective, reliable, durable, nature-based climate solutions is community-based, Indigenous-led, rigorous measurement of ecosystem carbon. And so, yeah, I'm really privileged to be able to share this with you today.
Thanks, James. And
it was just, I couldn't see the slides, but when the word peat came up, it came up, it sort of resonated in my head for 2 reasons. One, when I was a student, my tutor was a peat ecologist, and I used to spend half my time looking at peat bogs. But the other reason was, in Belize, we've also been looking at peat, because believe it or not, you get tropical peatlands, and quite often it's a whole system. And so, for instance, we're working on seagrass, we're working on mangrove, and we're working on peat. Quite often that's all part of the same system. And if you take any one, or if any one of those 3 habitats gets impacted, it can impact the other 2. And so in Belize, we're really proud about the fact that we're actually working on seagrass, on mangrove, and on peatland. And we've just been, in fact, my colleague Kim at the front leads a project mapping peatland in Belize, and we're looking to include that in their NDC as well. But I mean, for me, the importance there is sometimes you do have to work on individual habitats in order to start building momentum, but you also need to look outside of that and figure out, well, is there a bigger system here that we should be thinking about? And these habitats are reliant on one another, and we should actually be looking at that system as a whole.
Yeah, it's excellent points, and I think it leads to our final question for the panelists, which is, the thing about nature-based climate solutions, there's always this element of vulnerability, long-term existence, and so on. And I was wondering if, and as we're going to need to count on them, and some countries more than others, to reach their NDC targets, can you speak to a little bit about impediments and how we get around them in the use of them in that context?
So I normally like to say things in 3s, but I actually thought of about 4 key points to make as to lessons learned, what we're learning from our work. I mean, and number 1, I come back to the point I made earlier. How do you show up? How do you show up as an organization in countries where you may not have an office or a presence? And for me, it's all about relationships. It's all about partnerships. And it's about ownership. The ownership is not with Pew. The ownership is with the country. The key is in the words nationally determined. It has to be nationally determined. If they don't have ownership, they don't have investment, and it will not last. So how you show up is crucial. I think the next point to make is about baseline data. You've got to get the baseline data right. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And that leads into point 3, which is finance. If you don't get the baseline data right and you go out looking for finance, then you could find yourself in a lot of trouble. Seychelles, if they'd gone out on the basis of 2 million hectares of seagrass looking for finance, would now be slightly in a problematic situation if they got finance for 2 million hectares. So getting the data, baseline data, is crucial. Every NDC will have one line in it, subject to financing. So the next consideration, point 3, is finance. We have to get the finance in place to actually pay for these NDCs over time. How do you monitor, measure, and manage over time? How do you make sure that the country's commitment to protect these habitats as part of their NDC can actually be implemented? And then the fourth one would be around capacity. We always say that we don't do capacity building because there's always capacity in country. We think about it as capacity enhancement. How do we enhance capacity? But one of the problems that countries have is literally the number of people who are able to work on these issues. So how do you design the finance, the management, the monitoring to fit with the capacity in country? You have to think of it from that perspective rather than thinking, oh, we can just build capacity. It doesn't always work like that. Those would be the 4 key takeaways I'd put forward.
Excellent. Thanks, Simon. Yeah. James, any comments?
Well, certainly, I think there's 2 that I see as direct commonalities in the Canadian experience. So much of what the work that we support, but that we see is underway in the Canadian context in terms of nature-based climate solutions is inherently Indigenous-led. And as a consequence, that is highly transformative at times in terms of challenging the status quo, and what that might mean in terms of regulatory, legislative, and management systems across the country. In terms of, for instance, the advancement of Indigenous protected and conserved areas. And as a consequence, that question of jurisdiction and authority is at its core one of the significant hurdles that we're seeing in terms of effective nature-based climate solutions in many parts of the country today, which is that Indigenous nations, First Nations, for instance, in BC, are looking to resume and exert that right and responsibility on the land, but need to do so in a way that's in collaboration with Crown governments. There are, I'd say, emerging areas where that's absolutely happening, but it is transformative in itself in terms of that process. And so how to drive it actually connects to your second point, which is investment, right? So what are those drivers in terms of the financial incentives to see that transformation, the mechanism in terms of bringing forward the revenue, the funding that's necessary to support the types of activities, whether it's forest management for ecosystem health, whether it's broad-scale ecosystem restoration for ecosystem health and culturally important values. But these are not necessarily going to be large drivers of capital and revenue in the way that our extractive approaches and historical approaches to management have been, which leads us to hop, step, and to jump so often. I'm surprised it hasn't come up yet in this conversation in terms of emerging markets like carbon markets and biodiversity credits. And while that has a lot of enthusiasm, some might say hype in many parts of the world, doing so in robust ways that deliver those outcomes where those revenues and investments actually make it to local communities, that to me is the central conversation that we have on a practically weekly, if not daily basis with so many of our partners.
Yeah, Simon, in we have First Nation, Inuit communities. In some of the places you're working, is that an issue as well, where the rights and titles to some of these nature-based activities like the ecosystems, do you ever run into sort of a clash about, well, the government isn't interested, but the people are, or the people aren't interested and the government is? Has that happened in any of the countries you're in right now?
Yeah, no, that is something that we are aware of. I mean, I have to say that the way Pew works is that we don't have country offices. We don't have dozens of people in country for Pew. We tend to work through a local partner. So for instance, in Mozambique, we worked through a local NGO called Lakulu, and in Tanzania, we actually worked through Wetlands International because that was what the government said was their preferred NGO. But to give you an example how it kind of spirals out from there, I mean, Lakulu will be doing multiple different local workshops all the way along the coast with local communities, talking about what is seagrass, why is it important. I remember when there's a lady, a doctor, Blandina, who works out of the University of Dar es Salaam, and we were funding her. You know, she's part of the project, and she was doing a lot of the third-party field verification, so going out checking, is it seagrass? And within her sort of budget submission, she put in for 25 workshops with local communities along the coast. So yes, I mean, I think it's maybe slightly different in terms of indigenous communities, but there are community groups that we have to engage with, or our in-country partners or researchers have to engage with to build support. And if I can just sort of flip back to the Seychelles on that one, because I think there's an interesting community or certainly local angle there. So when we started work on seagrass in the Seychelles, there's one word for seagrass, and it was gomo, which basically means green and slimy, and it's the same word that is used for seagrass and for seaweed. Now there's actually about 4 different species of seagrass in the Seychelles, and what SEICAT did as a result of the mapping and identifying of those 4 different seagrass types was then to do a public campaign in the Seychelles on the different types of seagrasses. They actually had a bus with all the different seagrasses on it, and then the names of the seagrass, and then what they did was to actually put those names into the Seychelles Creole dictionary. So now, instead of there just being one word for seagrass, they now have individual names for each of the species. So, and that's one, I know that's one tiny thing, but that does create that sort of like local involvement and understanding of why it is, what we're doing and why we're doing it. Because then about a year later, there was an application of this old disused hotel in the Seychelles. They had an application to do it up again and put in a breakwater, and the breakwater would have sat on one of the most important seagrass areas off the coast of the main island in Mahi. And all the public basically rose up and said, no, we don't want it, because it's going to, we've found out about this seagrass and you're going to destroy this seagrass bed. And so the hotel application was turned down by the government. So there's a good example about how, I mean, it's a different scale for you guys. I mean, you've got to remember that Seychelles population is 40,000. So it's a different scale, but these are good examples about how, if people understand why you're doing it and what it's about, they're then invested and they can get behind it, and it works out brilliantly.
That's fantastic. Yeah. I guess it's time for Q&A. Does anybody in the audience have a question? Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so one question for each. So, James, I really like this connection you did about the monitoring efforts and potential financial mechanisms like voluntary you mentioned carbon markets, not voluntary, and biodiversity credits. So if you can detail a little bit what is the potentiality to connect these monitoring efforts with these mechanisms, it will be amazing, because I also see a lot of possibilities and hopes to move from the monitoring to the action through financial mechanisms. So it will be amazing. And for Simon, I am seeing a big challenge in the connection between national determinate contributions and the monitoring efforts, because when you see how the countries report the performance and the emissions and also the adaptation, they use the national systems that not necessarily include all these efforts and the level of detail we are implemented. To mention, for example, seagrasses. And when you see national determinate contributions in the mitigation sectors, in inventories, any of the countries include what is happening with the seagrasses, and that happens with many sectors. And you mentioned that we need to create capabilities. So if you can analyze a little bit this connection between monitoring efforts and how we could, in fact, increase the capability to countries really include these monitoring efforts and the national determinate contributions, probably through to enhance the monitoring methodologies that are implementing also in the national inventories. I think there is a super interesting connection. Sorry to make
That's okay. So, sorry, I should have mentioned early on, we also cored the seagrass to get carbon values for it. So we have carbon values for the seagrass, say for instance in the Seychelles, and we're also getting carbon values for the seagrass in the whole of the Western Indian Ocean. And the countries are then putting those into their greenhouse gas inventories. So they are accounting, they are able to account basically for how much carbon is stored within those habitats. And mangrove and seagrass actually store quite a significant amount of carbon. It's not as significant as reducing large-scale greenhouse gas emissions associated with transport or energy production, but it still is a value that we can account. The other value I think we have to consider, it's not just about mitigation, it's about adaptation as well. Jamaica is one of our countries that we work in. Certainly mangrove, in fact we have a meeting later to discuss an opportunity to be able to show in Jamaica how communities that had protected their mangroves in Jamaica at the time of the recent hurricane Melissa basically suffered less damage. So, and seagrass and mangrove all play that role of adaptation in terms of reducing impact from storm surge and from hurricanes. So I would say for me, you've got to think of it in terms of mitigation and adaptation as well. I think the added value I would also say for coastal wetlands is that they're also phenomenal in terms of nursery grounds for fish species. Something like 70% of offshore fish species use these habitats as a nursery ground. They're also important for communities and livelihoods as well, local communities and livelihoods. So they're kind of ticking multiple boxes, both in terms of climate, mitigation, adaptation, and community coherence, and food and livelihoods. I hope that answers the question, but happy to talk more afterwards.
Yeah, very interesting. I'm looking to hearing more about that too. Thank you for that question. In that it's, I would say, a conversation that we have across the collaborators that have been involved in this work on a very regular basis in terms of the methodologies and the tools, the resources that are available, and doing this measurement of ecosystem carbon in a way that could be consistent in the future with emerging markets like voluntary or compliance markets, which are emerging in the Canadian context. But the barriers, I would say, in the Canadian context to effective carbon markets are actually at its core these jurisdictional issues of whose right is it in terms of laying the claim to those carbon benefits, and the potential tension and legal conflict between First Nations, Indigenous communities, and Crown governments, and where that jurisdiction right now in many parts of the country is unclear. So I would say at its core, the answer is yes. You know, the methodologies, the tools, the resources are being developed in a way that are consistent with best practice and the protocols of those emerging markets, because many of the nations, the indigenous nations that are investing in this kind of work are very much interested in those markets on an emerging basis as a way to fund and support things like indigenous protected and conserved areas. They need long-term mechanisms in terms of funding ecological restoration that goes on over decades, and to get the outcomes that are necessary to meet the commitments of the reasons why we're here. But we need that driver of finance that can be sustainable. And of course, the carbon market is the one piece that for so many is just on the edge of the horizon. But whether that will be realized in Canada at this time is very unclear, and whether or not those benefits can be delivered directly to Indigenous nations, especially, that's the piece that I think we're trying to understand, and many nations are watching this very, very closely. Yeah.
Thanks both. Anybody else have a question? Yes.
Hi. Thanks for your sharing. I just wanted to ask about In terms of the existing methodologies for such nature-based solutions, because we consider like throughout different ecosystems around the world, maybe they're very heterogeneous in terms of their ecological dynamics. They're just wondering whether existing methodologies are perhaps well equipped or sufficiently equipped to account for the different ecosystem dynamics, and perhaps as a result of that, the different carbon sequestration potentials of the different habitats around the world. Yeah, thanks.
I'm not the expert. I'll have a go. I think, so I will always argue that don't let perfect be the enemy of good. I mean, the methodologies that we've got work up to a point, but I also think you have to sort of like modify as you go along. So for instance, when we started looking at seagrass, there was methodologies on seagrass, but what we did was bring a load of experts together in a workshop from day one to say, okay, if we're going to do this at scale, what methodology should we be using? What are the best practices that we should be using? And then build out from that, but constantly keep going back. I mean, to your point about, you know, the different, even within seagrass, so for instance, seagrass in the WIO, the Western Indian Ocean, absorbs more carbon than, say, seagrass in the Caribbean. It's just through different physiology and different climatic conditions. So, you know, you're right, these things have to be taken into account and they're going to vary, but I would say there are methodologies that you can work to, but you can always improve them, and you should always be looking to improve them.
I would just say I'm in an entire agreement with that answer, Simon, which is, you know, there are international protocol and methods that then can be, you know, downstep to national and then regional. Like, I think the overall sense is the degree to which that you can adapt and refine your methodology to the regional and local specifics, your accuracy is probably likely to increase. What that minimum requirement is, that's the question, right? And of course, there are, you know, very clear protocols and methods that are out there. But is perfect the enemy of good, and where is that right level is exactly the discussion I think that so many people are having. Yeah.
Anybody else? Looks like that's it. Yeah, I think that's great. Feel free to come and talk. They'll probably be here for another 5 minutes or so if you want to talk one-on-one. And thank you so much, Simon. Thank you, James. I think that's a really interesting discussion that I think this element gets overlooked sometimes, like this practical reality of this work. It's really hard. It's really complicated. It's very inspiring to talk about the nature part of reducing emissions, because it's just about nature, right? It's like, what did we hear yesterday? More nature fights climate change. You know, it's a great story, but the reality is quite challenging and quite complex. So, great examples. Thank you so much to everybody for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And if I may, a last plug, the QR code is a link to the tools and resources and video on the page there in terms of the measurement of ecosystem carbon. So, thank you, everyone.